is something ancient, something that has survived the rise and fall of kingdoms, something that has been feared by forces in both the visible and invisible world. It does not roar like a lion, it does not flash like lightning, but it carries within it a power that unsettles darkness and disturbs the agenda of every unclean spirit. That something is salt. You must understand that in the realm of the Spirit, nothing is coincidental. There is no such thing as a random symbol in Scripture. God is not poetic for entertainment. He is purposeful in every metaphor, every analogy, every declaration. When God calls you the salt of the earth, He is not trying to make you feel good. He is unlocking your identity. He is whispering to you a mystery, a key, a weapon. He is telling you what witches already know and what many Christians still ignore. Salt is not seasoning, it is strategy. Salt is not a condiment, it is a covenant. Long before refrigerators existed, salt was used to preserve, to stop decay, to keep things from rotting. When Jesus said, "You are the salt of the earth," He was saying, you are the divine agent sent to prevent the moral decomposition of this planet. Witches know this. That's why they fear it. Not because of the grain itself, but because of the revelation it carries. Salt is a reminder that corruption can be stopped, that what they try to rot with sin, deception, and perversion can be preserved by someone who walks in truth. Salt is power. In the Old Testament, salt was used in sacrifices. Every offering to God had to be seasoned with salt. Why? Because salt was a symbol of covenant. It was binding, eternal, permanent. You cannot separate the salt from the offering once it's been mixed. And likewise, you cannot separate the believer from power once they have truly walked in covenant with the living God. Salt does not ask permission to be noticed. You don't have to search for salt in your food. You taste it immediately. That is how your life should be. A believer who has lost their saltiness is like a sword that cannot cut. It looks sharp, but it's useless. That is why the enemy is not afraid of Christians who shout, dance, post verses, and play church. No. He fears those who are salty. Witches tremble not because of rituals, but because of authority. And salt is a sign of spiritual authority. The Bible says, Elisha the prophet took salt and threw it into bitter waters, and the waters were healed. It wasn't the salt that healed it, it was the prophet who understood the mystery behind it. Salt in the hand of a man or woman who knows who they are in the Spirit becomes a divine instrument. He also is divine, who knows divinity. If he listens to him, he stands out and decrees. He who knows divinity is the master of spirit, and the waters were healed. It wasn't the salt that healed it. It becomes a prophetic tool. It becomes a weapon. Have you ever asked why witches use salt in their rituals? Not to honor God, but to counterfeit His principles. They understand what many believers have neglected. They use salt to create boundaries, to declare intent, to summon spirits, but their use is corruption, a perversion of a holy symbol. The reason witches fear salt is because the original purpose of salt is rooted in divine order. It carries the presence of heaven's authority. So when a true believer applies the power of salt, not the grain, but the revelation, every dark force in that region takes notice. That's why in your house, when you walk around praying, don't just speak with volume, speak with understanding. You're not just shouting, you are seasoning the atmosphere. You're not just quoting verses, you are releasing salt. You are preserving your home, your family, your mind, your calling. You are pushing back corruption, rot, bitterness, perversion, manipulation. The salt of God in your spirit refuses to allow decay to dwell where you live. Salt makes demons uncomfortable. Salt carries memory. Every fallen spirit that rebelled in the heavens knows the significance of salt. They saw it in the courts of the temple. They witnessed it in the sacrifices of priests. They felt its weight when God ratified covenants with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Salt is not just a mineral, it is a message. It is a declaration that what God has called clean, no man or demon can call unclean. When you rise in the morning and declare, I am the salt of the earth, you are not speaking religious poetry. You are reminding darkness that you are the reason decay cannot have dominion. This is why Satan fears people who walk in purity, because purity is salt in motion. A man or woman who refuses compromise is a living grain of salt. Every time you say no to sin, you preserve the testimony of Christ in your generation. Every time you choose righteousness over relevance, you are stopping spiritual rot. You don't have to scream to be powerful. You just have to be salty. Witches don't fear noise. They fear substance. They fear people who know how to walk in holiness, pray with consistency, and live with spiritual discipline. They fear salt because salt cannot be ignored. Have you ever tasted a dish with too much salt? It dominates the flavor. That's how your presence should be. When you enter a room, witches should taste something different in the air. When you walk in, there should be an atmospheric shift. Not because you announced your arrival, but because your salt announced you before you opened your mouth. Salt works quietly, but it leaves a loud effect. It doesn't need a stage. It doesn't need applause. Salt just does its job. It heals, it preserves, it purifies, it flavors. It doesn't need attention to function. That is why witches fear salty believers, because you don't have to say much, but your presence shuts down their assignment. The enemy has tried to reduce salt to superstition, tried to make it a superstition of tossing it over your shoulder or placing it at your doorstep. But let me tell you, salt is not superstition. It is sacred. It is not a ritual, it is a revelation. When you understand that, you will stop reacting to spiritual attacks and stop operating in spiritual authority. You will stop asking for deliverance and start walking in dominion. Salt was never designed to be passive. It is active, alive, intrusive. That is why hell launches attacks against salty Christians, because you are interrupting their program. You are a disruption to the agenda of witches. Some of you have been wondering why the warfare has increased. It's not because you're weak, it's because your salt level is rising. You've been praying, fasting, consecrating, declaring the word, and now the witches in your region are uneasy. They sense your growth. They smell your salt. That's why the attacks came. That's why your dreams shifted. That's why the atmosphere got tight, because your salt is causing a reaction in the spirit realm. You are disturbing nests. You are unseating territorial spirits. You are releasing the fragrance of purity, and demons hate the smell. Salt burns when it touches wounds. That's why some people around you are irritated by your presence. Not because you did anything wrong, but because your salt is irritating their compromise. Your holiness reminds them of what they've ignored. Your prayers expose their dryness. Your discipline shines a light on their apathy. Don't reduce your saltiness to make others comfortable. Salt is supposed to stand out. Salt is supposed to sting. Salt is supposed to preserve, even when it hurts. And here is the deeper mystery. Jesus said, if the salt loses its savor, it is good for nothing. What a powerful statement. It is possible to look like salt but lack taste. It is possible to attend church, carry a Bible, even preach, but have no preserving power, no healing, no impact, no authority. Witches do not fear titles. They fear taste. They fear essence. They fear real power. And power is not in noise, power is in salt. When last did your presence shift the room? When last did your prayer silence confusion? When last did you season a conversation with grace, truth, and fire? You were not saved to blend in, you were saved to preserve. You were not anointed to entertain demons, you were anointed to drive them out. Your assignment is not comfort, it is confrontation. And your weapon is not a sword, it is salt. Elisha threw salt into the water. The prophet applied a spiritual symbol to a natural issue, and the supernatural responded. That's your life. When you walk into corrupt systems, schools, businesses, governments, you are the salt that heals the waters. When you raise your children in truth, you are throwing salt into generational bitterness. When you pray for your spouse, you are salting their mind. When you intercede for your church, your city, your nation, you are preserving it from decay. Witches fear salt because salt is prophetic. It sees ahead, it prepares, it guards. Salt doesn't just react, it prevents. And that is the greatest threat to darkness, a believer who is not just defensive, but prophetic. You see, salt stops the curse before it starts. It stops depression before it lands. It stops divorce before it enters the house. It stops suicide before it whispers its name. Salt is not just healing, it is guarding. The time has come to stop playing church and start being salt. The time has come to rise in our authority, to stop begging for mercy and start walking in mastery. You were not called to survive, you were called to preserve. To stand in a decaying world and say, corruption stops here. To walk into environments infected by witchcraft, rebellion, manipulation, and sin, and purify it with presence. The reason witches fear salt is not because of the crystal, but because of the Christian. The real believer, the one who knows their place, the one who walks in covenant, the one who is not shaken by trends or intimidated by attacks, the one who understands. Salt was always a weapon, and now it's time to use it. So now the question becomes, what kind of salt are you? Are you the kind that sits on the shelf, looking clean, refined, and untouched, but never applied, never tasted, never tested? Or are you the kind of salt that has been poured out, scattered in battle, applied to bitter waters, mixed into the earth and used by God to preserve, to heal, to cleanse, to shift atmospheres and silence witches? Because salt that remains in the shaker has no impact. Salt in the bottle doesn't heal water. Salt behind stained glass windows cannot transform a dying world. Salt has to leave the sanctuary and enter the soil. Salt has to move into bitter territory, dark homes, rebellious regions, infected environments, and release its preserving, purifying power. You are not called to be pretty, you are called to be powerful. You are not called to blend, you are called to season. That is why witches fear salt. Because you don't just look like a Christian, you taste like one. And let me tell you, the taste of true Christianity is not sugar. It's not sweet compromise. It's not watered down theology. It's not lukewarm performance. The taste of true Christianity is salt. Sharp, undeniable, sometimes uncomfortable, but always impactful. Salt speaks when others are silent. Salt stands when others bow. Salt resists when others yield. Salt preserves when others would abandon. That's why the enemy has spent decades trying to strip the church of its saltiness. He doesn't mind if you shout, sing, and jump, as long as you don't preserve anything. As long as you don't stop corruption. As long as you don't walk in revelation. But there is a remnant rising, a salty generation, a people who carry more than church culture. They carry covenant. A people who don't fear witches because they know who they are. A people who don't hide from darkness because they are the light. A people who don't run from spiritual warfare because they are the warfare. A people who walk into rooms and spirits begin to tremble. Not because they said a word, but because they walked in with salt. You don't need to chase deliverance ministers when you are salt. You don't need to fear the devil when you walk in divine authority. You don't need to panic over curses, spells, hexes, or demonic manipulation when you understand that the salt in you is a testimony of covenant with the living God. Salt is not scared of darkness. Darkness is scared of salt. That's why the enemy attacks your purity. Because purity is salt. That's why he fights your prayer life. Because intercession releases salt. That's why he wants you distracted. Because revelation makes you salty. That's why he entices you with compromise. Because obedience keeps your salt potent. He knows that once you become salt, truly salty, his influence ends where you stand. Some of you have forgotten your taste. You've allowed the pressures of life to dilute your salt. You've allowed people, relationships, wounds, and failures to soften your stand. But God is calling you back to potency. He's calling you back to power. He's calling you back to a sharp edge. Because when the salt loses its savor, it is good for nothing. It's time to get your salt back. It's time to take authority in your home. Walk through your house and declare, no witch, no curse, no bitterness, no darkness will dwell where salt is present. It's time to pray over your children, your spouse, your region, your generation, and release salt into every decaying place. Speak the word, release the truth. Declare the covenant. You are not just praying, you are salting the waters. You are purifying the source. You are healing the root. Witches fear salt because salt leaves no room for decay. When salt arrives, the rotting must stop. When salt arrives, infection dies. When salt arrives, impurity flees. That's who you are. You are the salt of the earth. Not a suggestion, not a metaphor, not a poetic phrase, a declaration, a calling, a divine identity, the salt of the earth. Heaven is not looking for celebrities, it is looking for salt. God is not impressed by image, he is drawn to essence. Are you salty? Not flashy, not popular, not famous. Are you salty? Do you carry the weight of truth? Do you walk in the authority of the Spirit? Do you live in obedience when no one is watching? Do demons recognize you when you speak? Because witches don't care about your title. They don't care about your platform. They don't care about how many scriptures you can quote. They fear the salt, the one who can walk in silence and shift atmospheres. The one who can pray in the secret place and destroy altars in the spirit. The one who doesn't seek applause, only obedience. That kind of believer makes witches tremble. So today, rise in your identity. Let the fire of God restore your salt. Let your prayer life sharpen your savor. Let your holiness intensify your flavor. Let your worship be seasoned with salt. Let your obedience echo through the halls of hell. Let your faithfulness disturb the camps of darkness. Let your purity confront every principality. You were never meant to fit in. You were meant to stand out. You were never called to blend with corruption. You were called to preserve righteousness. You were never saved to be silent. You were saved to season the world. You are the salt that disturbs witches, shakes foundations, heals waters, guards generations, breaks curses, and silences the voice of the enemy. When you rise in the morning, remember who you are. When you walk through battle, remember who you are. When you face spiritual resistance, remember who you are. Salt is not shaken by fire. It remains. Salt is not afraid of bitterness. It transforms. Salt does not run from decay. It reverses it. Witches fear salt because salt cannot be bought, manipulated, or silenced. Salt is faithful. Salt is potent. Salt is consistent. Salt is a living testimony that covenant still speaks, that the kingdom still reigns, that Jesus still saves, and that darkness still bows. Let the salt speak. Let the salt rise. Let the salt take its place in you.